Welcome to MindRise Audiobooks. What you're about to hear is not a story that was meant to survive. It was burned, buried, scattered across centuries of deliberate silence. And yet, here it is, reaching you, specifically you, at this precise moment in history. That is not coincidence. That is not algorithm. Something older than both of those things is operating right now, and by the time this audiobook ends, you will understand exactly what that something is. Her name was Hypatia. She lived in Alexandria, Egypt, around the year 360 CE, and she was, by every measurable standard of her era, impossible. Not unlikely, not exceptional. Impossible. In a civilization that had already decided what women were permitted to know, permitted to teach, permitted to become, she stood at the intersection of mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and mystical geometry, and she did not whisper. She lectured, publicly, to crowds of students who traveled from across the known world to sit at her feet. Not because she was controversial, though she was, but because she possessed something that cannot be manufactured or purchased or inherited. She possessed clarity. The kind of clarity that arrives when a human mind stops performing for the world and begins receiving from something deeper. Her father was Theon of Alexandria, himself a scholar of extraordinary ability. He taught her the architecture of numbers, the language of the cosmos, the Ptolemaic models of celestial motion. But Theon, brilliant as he was, gave her the foundation. What Hypatia built on top of that foundation was something he had not anticipated, and perhaps could not fully comprehend. She moved beyond calculation into what the ancient Greeks called gnosis. Direct, unmediated knowledge. Not knowledge about the universe, knowledge from within it. She refined the astrolabe, an instrument used to map the positions of stars and calculate time with a precision that would not be matched for centuries. She developed commentaries on Diophantus and Apollonius that clarified mathematical frameworks so elegantly that modern historians still reference her organizational genius. But these achievements, as remarkable as they are not why her name has echoed through 1,500 years of human civilization. They are not why you are listening to this right now. Hypatia understood something that the most advanced branches of contemporary quantum physics are only now beginning to articulate in mathematical language. She understood that consciousness is not a byproduct of matter. She understood that the universe is not a machine running on mechanical laws, but a living, responsive, intelligent field, and that the human mind, properly cultivated, can interface with that field directly. Not metaphorically, not spiritually as a comfort, literally, structurally, as a function of physics that has simply been suppressed, distorted, and deliberately mislabeled as mysticism by institutions with a profound interest in keeping that particular door locked. The school she led, the Neoplatonic School of Alexandria, was not simply an academy in the modern sense. It was a transmission system, a carefully constructed environment in which human beings were trained over years of disciplined practice to expand the bandwidth of their perception. The curriculum included mathematics not as abstract calculation, but as a living map of universal structure. It included astronomy not as a cataloging exercise,
but as a method of orienting the self within a cosmos that was understood to be conscious. It included philosophy not as debate, but as a technology of interior transformation. Students did not graduate from Hypatia's school with credentials. They graduated with access. Access to a mode of cognition that the ancient world recognized and the modern world has spent enormous institutional energy pretending does not exist. Why would modern institutions want to suppress a mode of cognition?
That is exactly the right question. And it is the question that Hypatia's death, her murder to be precise, answers with devastating clarity. In 415 CE, she was seized by a mob in the streets of Alexandria, dragged to a church, stripped, and killed. The historical record is unambiguous about who organized this act. It was a faction of early Christian zealots operating under the authority of Cyril, the Archbishop of Alexandria, a man who had already demonstrated his willingness to use coordinated violence against communities he perceived as threats to his consolidating power. Hypatia was killed not because she was a woman who had transgressed social boundaries, though that was the excuse. She was killed because she represented a living, breathing, teaching demonstration that human beings do not require institutional intermediaries to access truth. She was killed because she was evidence. And evidence, in the hands of the wrong authority, becomes the most dangerous substance on earth. The Library of Alexandria, or rather, the complex of institutions that surrounded it, did not fall in a single dramatic fire. That is a story told for simplicity. The reality is more disturbing and more instructive. The great repository of accumulated human knowledge in Alexandria deteriorated across multiple centuries through a combination of deliberate destruction, systematic neglect, and the kind of slow institutional suffocation that does not make for dramatic historical narrative, but is extraordinarily effective at eliminating knowledge that threatens existing power structures. By the time Hypatia was murdered, much of what had been housed in those collections had already been removed, destroyed, or hidden. Her death was not a beginning. It was a conclusion. It was the final act in a centuries-long campaign to sever the living transmission of a particular kind of knowing from the human population at large. But here is what that campaign could not accomplish. It could not destroy the pattern. It could not eliminate the underlying structure from which that knowledge emerged, because that structure is not stored in libraries. It is not written in scrolls. It is encoded in the architecture of reality itself, in the mathematical relationships that govern the behavior of quantum fields, in the geometric ratios that appear identically in the spiraling arms of galaxies and the spiraling structure of DNA, in the resonance frequencies that Hypatia's contemporaries called the music of the spheres, and that modern physicists now call something with considerably more equations attached to it, but pointing in precisely the same direction. The pattern survived. It survived in the fragments of Neoplatonic text that made it through the medieval period into the hands of Islamic scholars who preserved and extended them. It survived in the geometric architecture of certain sacred buildings constructed by people who understood that space itself can be shaped to amplify states of consciousness. It survived in the work of individuals across every century, individuals who, often without knowing each other's names, without belonging to the same tradition, without access to each other's research, arrived independently at the same fundamental understanding that the universe is a field of intelligent information, that consciousness is primary rather than derivative, and that the human nervous system is a sophisticated antenna capable of receiving and transmitting within that field at frequencies that conventional science has not yet fully mapped, but is now, with increasing urgency, beginning to measure. This is the Ascension Code, not a metaphor, not a marketing term, a literal description of a set of principles, mathematical, physical, neurological, and philosophical, that describe the mechanism by which human consciousness can shift from a contracted, fear-based, survival-oriented mode of operation to an expanded, coherent, field-integrated mode that the ancient world knew by many names and that modern neuroscience is beginning to describe in the language of gamma-wave synchronization, default mode network suppression, and heightened interoceptive awareness. The shift is real, the mechanism is real, and the reason you have not been taught about it in any school, in any mainstream institution, in any structure designed to prepare you for participation in modern civilization is also real and is exactly what Hypatia understood with enough clarity that the most powerful religious and political authority in her region organized her murder to stop her from transmitting it further. If you are listening to this, something in you already knows this, not as a thought, not as a belief, as a felt sense, a persistent, low-frequency recognition that has followed you through your life, surfacing in moments of stillness, in dreams, in the uncanny feeling that the version of reality you have been handed by society is not the full picture. That feeling is not pathology. It is not arrogance. It is not delusion. It is the receiver in your nervous system detecting a signal that is actually there, that has always been there, that Hypatia spent her entire life teaching people to tune into with precision and integrity. Some of you listening have spent years feeling profoundly out of place in ordinary social systems. You find small talk genuinely exhausting, not because you are antisocial, but because your nervous system is calibrated to a depth of processing that most casual social environments do not require or reward. You absorb the emotional states of people around you with an intensity that can be overwhelming. You are drawn to questions that most people around you have never thought to ask. You have a sensitivity to beauty, to pattern, to meaning that occasionally makes the ordinary texture of daily life feel almost unbearably shallow. These are not symptoms of dysfunction. They are indicators of a particular configuration of nervous system that, in Hypatia's school, would have been immediately recognized as the foundation for advanced perceptual training. What feels like your greatest difficulty in contemporary life may be, when properly understood and developed, your greatest capacity. The ancient world had a technology for this. Not technology in the mechanical sense, in the sense of a structured, transmissible method for developing a human capacity to its full expression. That technology was encoded in Hypatia's curriculum. It was encoded in the mathematical and philosophical training she provided. And fragments of it, fragmentary, stripped of context, frequently distorted, have survived in various traditions, emerging periodically in individuals and communities throughout the centuries, always on the margins, always outside the sanction of the dominant institutional power structure, always carrying the same essential transmission. You are more than you have been told. The cosmos is more than you have been shown. And the gap between what you are and what you could be is bridgeable. Not through belief, not through submission to any external authority, but through the direct development of faculties you already possess. Modern science is now arriving at the edges of this understanding through multiple independent pathways simultaneously, which is significant. It is significant in the way that convergent evolution is significant. When unconnected organisms independently develop the same solution to the same problem, it suggests that the solution is not arbitrary, but is being discovered rather than invented. Quantum biology, consciousness studies, network neuroscience, the physics of coherent systems. These fields are converging on a picture of reality that would have been entirely familiar to Hypatia and entirely consistent with what she was teaching in Alexandria 16 centuries ago. As you move through this audiobook, you will encounter that convergence in detail. You will hear the science. You will hear the history. You will hear the specific mechanisms by which both were suppressed, and the specific mechanisms by which both are now re-emerging. And you will hear, encoded within that information, something that cannot be fully captured in language, but that every person who encounters it recognizes immediately as true. Not because they have been convinced, but because they have been reminded. Before we move forward, one note. If you feel a quiet pull towards something as you listen, a sense of recognition that goes beyond intellectual agreement, that is worth paying attention to. Some people who find their way to this material mark that recognition in small ways. Some leave the number 1111, not as superstition, but as a personal acknowledgement that something in them has aligned with something larger. If that resonates with you, it will make sense. If it does not need to. She was not working in isolation. This is crucial to understand, because the mythology of the lone genius, the singular, isolated mind that conjures truth from nothing, is itself one of the most effective tools of suppression that has ever been deployed against human intellectual development. Lone geniuses can be killed. Traditions can be severed. But networks, distributed, redundant, encoded in multiple formats across multiple locations, are extraordinarily difficult to destroy completely. Hypatia was the visible node of a network. She was the teacher who stood in the public square and lectured to crowds because she had calculated, correctly, that visible transmission was more powerful than hidden transmission. More powerful precisely because it was more dangerous. She knew the risk. The historical record suggests she was explicitly warned multiple times to moderate her public profile, to accommodate the political realities of an Alexandria that was rapidly reorganizing itself around the consolidating authority of a militant Christianity. She declined, not from naivete, from an assessment of what was actually at stake. What was at stake was a particular understanding of the human being. In the cosmology that Hypatia transmitted, rooted in Neoplatonism, in Pythagorean mathematics, In the Egyptian mystery traditions that Alexandria had absorbed and synthesized over centuries, the human being was understood as a microcosm, not poetically, structurally. The same mathematical ratios that organized the motions of celestial bodies organized the architecture of the human form. The same harmonic relationships that structured the intervals between planetary orbits structured the relationships between the organ systems of the body. The same principles of resonance, of coherence, of information transmission that governed the behavior of the cosmos at its largest scales governed the behavior of consciousness at its most intimate. To know the universe was to know the self. To develop the self was to develop the capacity to perceive the universe with increasing accuracy. The two projects were not separate. They were the same project, approached from two different directions. This understanding had practical consequences that the established power structure found intolerable. If a human being is a microcosm, if the same intelligence that organizes the cosmos is operating within and as every human consciousness, then no external authority can position itself as the necessary mediator between that human being and ultimate truth. No institution, no hierarchy, no church, no state, no system of credentialing or certification. The direct path is always available, always open, always the most reliable route to genuine knowledge. Institutions survive by making themselves necessary. Hypatia's teaching made a particular class of institution unnecessary, and that institution responded in the way that threatened institutions have always responded when reason and persuasion have failed, with organized, authorized violence. Understanding this history is not a detour from the science. It is the science. The suppression of certain forms of knowledge is not ancient history in the sense of being over, concluded, filed under regrettable but resolved. It is an ongoing structural feature of knowledge production systems that are embedded within and dependent upon existing power arrangements. The specific content of what is suppressed shifts across time. The mechanism does not. And recognizing the mechanism, understanding how and why certain lines of inquiry get defunded, discredited, marginalized, or simply never pursued in the first place, is an essential component of understanding why the convergence happening right now in quantum biology, consciousness research, and coherence physics carries the particular charge that it does. These are not simply new scientific findings. They are findings that the structure of the system was specifically designed to prevent, and that are emerging anyway, because reality does not ultimately comply with institutional preferences. The astrolabe that Hypatia refined was an instrument for precisely locating oneself within a larger field, for determining where you are in relation to the movements of a cosmos that is always in motion. The training she offered was also, at its deepest level, an instrument for precisely locating oneself within a larger field. The outer instrument and the inner instrument were understood to be operating on the same principles. The same mathematics that allowed a navigator to determine position by reference to the stars was, in the Neoplatonic framework, a version of the same mathematics by which a developed consciousness could orient itself within the field of universal intelligence. Hypatia did not consider these to be metaphorically related. She considered them to be literally expressions of the same underlying structure, visible at different scales. That structure is what modern physics calls scale invariance, the property of certain mathematical relationships to appear identically at every level of organization, from the quantum to the cosmic. The Fibonacci sequence appears in the breeding patterns of rabbits, in the arrangement of seeds in a sunflower, in the spiral structure of galaxies. The same ratio, the same pattern, across scales that differ by factors of billions. This is not coincidence in any scientifically meaningful sense of that word. It is evidence of an underlying organizational principle that operates across all scales of physical reality. Hypatia knew this. She encoded it in her mathematical teachings, and the implications of that knowledge, taken seriously, are exactly as radical as the institution that murdered her believed them to be. There is a moment in the development of any serious inquiry when the accumulation of evidence crosses a threshold. Before that threshold, the evidence is interesting, suggestive, worth paying attention to. After it, something different happens. The pattern becomes undeniable, not as a matter of opinion or interpretation, but as a matter of structural necessity. The pieces are not pointing toward a conclusion. They are the conclusion, and the only remaining question is whether the person encountering them has the courage to follow the logic wherever it leads, regardless of how far that destination sits from the territory marked as acceptable by the maps they were given in childhood. We are at that threshold right now, not approaching it, at it. The convergence of findings from quantum biology, from network neuroscience, from the physics of coherent systems, from consciousness research conducted at institutions that have sufficient institutional insulation to pursue lines of inquiry that mainstream funding structures actively discourage. This convergence is not gradual anymore. It is rapid. It is accelerating. And it is pointing, with increasing precision, at exactly what Hypatia was transmitting in Alexandria 16 centuries ago. That consciousness is the foundational substrate of reality. That the human nervous system is capable of operating at levels of coherence and field integration that conventional models of psychology and neuroscience have systematically underestimated, and that the mathematical architecture of the universe is not external to human awareness, but is, in some profound and measurable sense, the structure of human awareness itself. Let us be specific, because vagueness is the enemy of genuine understanding, and the material we are covering deserves more than the soft, undifferentiated language of ordinary spiritual discourse. Quantum biology is the study of quantum mechanical effects in biological systems, effects that were, until relatively recently, assumed to be irrelevant at the temperatures and scales at which living organisms operate. Classical physics said that quantum coherence, the property by which quantum systems maintain correlated states across distance, was too fragile to survive the warm, wet, noisy environment of a living cell. Biology, in this view, was classical mechanics all the way down. Then the evidence started arriving. In 2007, a research team studying photosynthesis in green sulfur bacteria published findings that stopped the relevant scientific community in its tracks. They discovered that the transfer of energy through the photosynthetic complex, the process by which plants and certain bacteria convert light into chemical energy with an efficiency that classical physics cannot account for, was occurring via quantum coherence. The energy was not traveling through the molecular system by random diffusion, the way a classical particle would. It was simultaneously exploring all possible pathways through a quantum superposition
and arriving with a precision and efficiency that only makes sense if the system is operating as a quantum processor rather than a classical one. Life, it turned out, had been using quantum computation for billions of years. We had simply not been looking for it, because our theoretical frameworks had told us it could not be there. This discovery opened a door. Through that door came findings about quantum effects in avian navigation, the mechanism by which certain birds orient themselves within the Earth's magnetic field involves quantum entanglement within molecules in the retina, a process that is now relatively well established and that implies a level of environmental sensitivity in biological systems that classical models cannot approach. Through that door came findings about quantum coherence in enzyme catalysis, in olfactory reception,
In the behavior of microtubules within neurons, the structural elements of nerve cells that some researchers, most prominently the physicist Roger Penrose and the anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff, have proposed as the site of quantum computation within the brain. The Penrose-Hameroff orchestrated objective reduction model remains controversial within mainstream neuroscience. It is also the most mathematically serious attempt to explain how consciousness could be a quantum phenomenon, and if it is correct, even partially, the implications for understanding human potential are almost incomprehensible in their scope. Because here is what quantum coherence in biological systems actually means when you follow the logic carefully. A quantum coherent system is not simply a system that is very efficient. It is a system that is, in a technically precise sense, non-local. The correlated quantum states that define coherence are not confined to a single location in space. They exist across the system simultaneously. Information is not transmitted through the system the way information travels through a wire, sequentially, locally, one point at a time. It is distributed through the system the way information is distributed through a hologram, simultaneously present at every point, with each part containing, in some sense, the whole. If the human nervous system operates with significant quantum coherence, and the evidence increasingly suggests that it does, at least in specific functional contexts, then the nervous system is not a local information processing device. It is a non-local field resonance system. And a non-local field resonance system does not interact with its environment the way a classical machine interacts with its environment. It interfaces with it. It becomes entangled with it. The boundary between inside and outside, between self and world, becomes, not metaphorically but physically, less absolute than our ordinary experience of that boundary suggests. Hypatia knew this. She did not have the language of quantum mechanics. She had the language of Neoplatonic cosmology, of Pythagorean mathematics, of the Egyptian mystery tradition's understanding of the relationship between the individual soul and the world soul. But the content, the actual structural understanding she was encoding in those languages, is the same content that quantum biology is now encoding in the language of modern physics. The soul is not a supernatural addition to the body. It is the field-coherent aspect of the body's operation. The world soul is not a metaphysical fantasy. It is the field of correlated quantum information within which all biological systems are continuously embedded and with which they are continuously interacting. The training that Hypatia's school provided was a training in developing and stabilizing the nervous system's capacity for coherent field interface, for sustained, disciplined, voluntary engagement with the non-local information field that the ancient world called by various names and that modern physics is beginning to describe with increasing mathematical precision. The mathematics itself is inseparable from this understanding. This is something that tends to get lost in popular treatments of quantum consciousness, which often either overclaim in ways that embarrass the science or underclaim in ways that strip the understanding of its actual significance. Mathematics, in the Pythagorean and Neoplatonic tradition that Hypatia inherited and extended, was not a human invention. It was a discovery, a mapping of structures that exist independently of human minds, and that the human mind, precisely because it shares structural properties with those forms, is capable of perceiving directly. The unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. The phrase belongs to physicist Eugene Wigner, who in 1960 wrote a famous essay noting that mathematical structures developed with no practical application in mind consistently turn out to describe physical reality with eerie precision. Is not a coincidence that requires a physicalist explanation. It is evidence that mind and cosmos share an underlying structure, that the map and the territory are made of the same substance, that consciousness is not looking at the universe from outside, it is the universe looking at itself from inside. This is the ascension code in its most precise formulation. Not a ladder to somewhere else, not an escape from physical reality into some superior non-physical realm. A deepening into the actual structure of physical reality, which turns out, under rigorous investigation, to be far more extraordinary, far more alive, far more continuous with consciousness than the materialist paradigm that has dominated Western science for the past 4 centuries has been willing to acknowledge. The code is not hidden because it is supernatural. It is hidden because acknowledging it would require a fundamental restructuring of the institutional frameworks, academic, political, economic, religious, that have organized Western civilization around a particular story about what human beings are and what they are capable of. That restructuring is, to put it plainly, enormously threatening to the entities whose power depends on the current story remaining unquestioned. Hypatia did not survive the last time this knowledge surfaced with sufficient clarity and transmission power to threaten those entities. She was not unique in this. The history of individuals and movements that have carried genuine versions of this understanding is substantially a history of suppression, persecution, and deliberate erasure. The Cathars, Giordano Bruno, the Hermetic philosophers of the Renaissance. Numerous indigenous knowledge systems that encoded understanding of consciousness field interaction in languages and practices that European colonial systems systematically destroyed because, among other reasons, those systems represented alternative frameworks for understanding reality that were genuinely incompatible with the ontology required to justify the colonial project. The pattern is consistent, the mechanism is consistent, and the consistency is itself information. It tells you something significant about what is actually being protected and why. What is being protected is a story about the nature of reality, the nature of the human being, and the nature of knowledge itself. In that story, reality is fundamentally material. Matter came first, and consciousness is what happens when matter becomes sufficiently complex. In that story, the human being is fundamentally a biological machine, sophisticated, capable of culture and language and mathematics, but ultimately governed by the same deterministic or randomly probabilistic physical laws that govern everything else. In that story, knowledge is what institutions certify, what passes through the approved channels of peer review, credentialing, and publication, filtered by the consensus of people whose careers and reputations are built on the existing framework. In that story, experiences of expanded awareness, of field connection, of non-local perception, of the kind of knowing that comes not from calculation, but from direct resonance. These are either delusion or neurological anomaly, or, at best, subjectively meaningful but objectively insignificant fluctuations in brain chemistry. Every piece of evidence we have been discussing says that story is wrong. Not partially wrong. Not wrong in peripheral details while correct in its fundamental architecture. Wrong in its foundational premises. Consciousness is not a byproduct of matter. Matter may well be a stable pattern within a primary field of consciousness. The human nervous system is not a closed local processor. It is an open, non-local, field-coherent system capable of modes of perception and knowing that the materialist story cannot account for. Knowledge is not only what institutions certify. Some of the most significant knowledge in human history has survived specifically by evading institutional certification. And the experiences of expanded awareness that the materialist story dismisses are, increasingly, the subject of serious scientific investigation that is producing findings consistent with the understanding Hypatia transmitted 16 centuries ago. There is a frequency to this recognition. Not metaphorically. There are actual, measurable neurological signatures associated with states of expanded coherence. Gamma-wave synchronization across widely separated cortical regions. Suppression of the default mode network, the neural system associated with self-referential, narrative-based thinking, accompanied by heightened activity in networks associated with present-moment, non-conceptual awareness. Increased heart rate variability, a physiological marker of the kind of nervous system flexibility and resilience associated with what researchers in psychophysiology call coherence. These states are reproducible. They are measurable. They correlate with subjective reports of expanded perception, of clarity, of the felt sense of connection to something larger than the individual self. They are, in other words, exactly what Hypatia was training her students to cultivate, described now in the language of contemporary neuroscience rather than Neoplatonic philosophy. If this material is landing in you with a weight that goes beyond intellectual interest, if something in you is responding to it not just as information, but as recognition, pay attention to that. The people who resonate most deeply with this understanding are often those who have spent significant portions of their lives feeling that the ordinary frameworks available to them were insufficient. Not because they were malfunctioning, because they were sensitive enough to detect the insufficiency. There is a difference between those two explanations, and that difference is everything. Some find that this is a moment they want to mark quietly. The number 777 has long been associated in various traditions with the alignment of the individual with larger structural patterns, not as superstition, but as a resonance marker. If you feel something like that alignment right now, you will know what to do with that number. If not, simply continue listening. There is a question that serious students of this material eventually arrive at, and it is not a comfortable question. It is the kind of question that, once genuinely asked, reorganizes everything around it. The question is this: if the knowledge we have been discussing is real, if consciousness is primary, if the human nervous system is a field-coherent system capable of non-local perception, if the mathematical architecture of the cosmos is continuous with the structure of awareness itself, then why does it feel so difficult to access? Why does the expanded state feel like the exception rather than the norm? Why does coherence require effort, discipline, specific conditions, while the contracted, fear-based, survival-oriented mode of operation that Hypatia's training was designed to transcend seems to be the default, the automatic, the gravitational pull that reasserts itself the moment deliberate practice is relaxed? This is not a rhetorical question. It has a specific, detailed, and genuinely disturbing answer. And understanding that answer is not optional if you want to understand the full scope of what Hypatia was teaching, what was destroyed when she was murdered, and what is at stake in the re-emergence of this understanding in the present moment. The human nervous system did not evolve in the conditions in which most contemporary human beings live. It evolved across hundreds of thousands of years in small, mobile communities, in direct and continuous sensory contact with natural environments, in social structures of relatively modest complexity, in the presence of regular practices, rhythmic movement, communal sound, periods of silence and stillness, contact with starlight and firelight, and the electromagnetic rhythms of the living earth, that maintained the nervous system in a state of baseline coherence, from which the expanded states that Neoplatonic training was designed to develop were a natural, accessible progression. The contracted state was not the baseline. The contracted state was the emergency response, the acute, time-limited mobilization of the survival system in response to immediate threat, followed by a return to coherent baseline as the threat resolved. What the modern environment has accomplished, through a combination of factors that are partly unintentional and partly very much the opposite, is the inversion of this arrangement. The contracted state has become the baseline. The emergency response has become chronic. The nervous system operates in a sustained condition of low-grade threat activation, not because there is a predator in the immediate environment, but because the electromagnetic environment is saturated with frequencies that the nervous system's threat detection system cannot distinguish from threat, because the social environment generates continuous, unresolvable status competition that the older parts of the brain process as survival relevant. Because the information environment is specifically engineered, and this word is chosen with precision, to maintain a state of anxious, fragmented, reactive attention that is maximally susceptible to the kind of influence that sells products, generates political compliance, and prevents the sustained, coherent, inward attention that genuine perceptual development requires. A nervous system locked in chronic contraction cannot access the field coherent states that Hypatia's training was designed to develop. Not because those states are supernatural or require special gifts that most people lack, because the physiological preconditions for those states, the baseline coherence from which they arise, has been systematically disrupted. This is not conspiracy in the dramatic, paranoid sense of that word. It does not require a secret room where powerful people meet to plan the suppression of human consciousness. It requires only what is plainly visible: economic systems that profit from human distraction, social systems that reward conformity and punish the kind of deep, independent, inward attention that genuine knowing requires, and information systems that are structurally incapable of transmitting the kind of knowledge that only passes through direct experience, through sustained practice, through the slow development of perceptual faculties that cannot be packaged, purchased, or consumed in the formats that modern information culture makes available. Hypatia's school was structured around the understanding that the development of higher perceptual faculties requires, first and foremost, the restoration and stabilization of nervous system coherence. The mathematical training was not separate from this. Mathematics, in the Pythagorean tradition, was a contemplative practice. The student did not simply learn to manipulate symbols according to established rules. The student was guided to perceive the relationships that the symbols encoded, to develop a direct, sensory-like apprehension of mathematical structure that, over time, trained the perceptual system to operate with increasing precision and depth. The astronomical training worked similarly. Observing the movements of celestial bodies was not data collection. It was an exercise in sustained, disciplined attention to patterns that operated across timescales vastly larger than the individual human life. An exercise that, practiced consistently, began to reorganize the practitioner's relationship to time, to scale, to the meaning of individual existence within a cosmos that was understood to be not indifferent, but intelligently structured and in some sense responsive to the quality of human attention directed toward it. This responsiveness of the cosmos to human attention is the point at which the ancient understanding and modern quantum physics converge most dramatically and most controversially. The measurement problem in quantum mechanics. The fact that the act of observation appears to influence the state of the system being observed. That quantum systems do not have definite properties independent of measurement. That the wave function describing the probability distribution of a particle's possible states collapses into a specific, definite state at the moment of observation, has been interpreted in numerous ways since its discovery in the early 20th century. The Copenhagen interpretation, which remains the dominant working framework among physicists, essentially brackets the problem. It says the mathematics works, use the mathematics, do not ask what is actually happening when a measurement is made. Other interpretations, the many worlds interpretation, relational quantum mechanics, cubism, attempt to address the problem in various ways. None of them has achieved consensus. None of them, it should be noted, has been able to fully eliminate consciousness from the picture without introducing other problems that are at least as serious. The physicist John Wheeler, one of the most significant figures in 20th century physics, spent the later decades of his career developing what he called the participatory universe. The idea that the universe is not a pre-existing structure that observers passively detect, but a structure that is, in some fundamental sense, brought into definite existence through the act of observation. Wheeler was not a mystic. He was a rigorous mathematical physicist who had worked on the hydrogen bomb, who had coined the term black hole, whose contributions to general relativity and quantum mechanics were of the first rank. And he concluded, on the basis of his engagement with the deepest levels of physical theory, that the universe is participatory, that consciousness is not a bystander to physical reality, that the relationship between mind and cosmos is reciprocal, active, and constitutive of the reality we experience. This is what Hypatia taught. This is what the Neoplatonic tradition encoded in the language available to it. This is what the Egyptian mystery tradition, which informed and shaped the intellectual culture of Alexandria across centuries before Hypatia's birth, had preserved in the form of initiatory practices designed to give the practitioner direct experiential access to the participatory nature of consciousness. And this is what was destroyed. Not completely, but substantially, when the tradition was severed by the violence that killed Hypatia and closed the school she represented. The fragments that survived are scattered. Some are in plain sight, encoded in mathematical and philosophical texts that have been preserved but have not been read with the understanding of what they actually contain. Some are in the architectural proportions of buildings constructed by people who understood that geometry is not merely decorative, but functional. That space shaped according to certain harmonic ratios creates conditions within the nervous system of people inhabiting that space that are measurably different from the conditions created by arbitrarily proportioned space. Some are in the contemplative traditions of various cultures, practices that have maintained functional knowledge of how to develop nervous system coherence and expand perceptual range, often under the protective cover of religious or cultural frameworks that have shielded them from the most direct forms of institutional suppression. And some fragments are in the emerging science itself. In the findings of researchers who arrived at the edges of this understanding through the normal channels of hypothesis, experiment, and measurement, and who found there something that their training had not prepared them for, and that the institutional structures of their fields were not equipped to accommodate. Researchers like Rupert Sheldrake, whose work on morphic resonance, the hypothesis that biological systems are shaped not only by their genetic inheritance, but by a field of information shared across species and across time, has been consistently dismissed by mainstream biology, not because his experimental methodology is unsound, but because his conclusions, if correct, require a fundamental revision of the materialist framework that biology has built its entire institutional structure upon. Researchers like Dean Radin at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, whose meta-analyses of hundreds of controlled experiments on anomalous cognition, the technical term for what is colloquially called psychic perception, demonstrate effect sizes that, in any other domain of research, would be considered overwhelmingly significant, but that are quarantined from serious mainstream consideration because the phenomenon they describe is incompatible with the story that the dominant framework needs to maintain. The pattern of suppression is not identical to what destroyed Hypatia. It does not use physical violence, at least not in Western academic contexts. It uses something more subtle and in some ways more effective: the management of credibility. a researcher who pursues lines of inquiry that threaten foundational assumptions does not need to be silenced. They need only to be defunded, to find their work unpublishable in high-impact journals, to be excluded from conferences, to have their institutional affiliations made untenable. The knowledge does not need to be burned. It needs only to be made invisible, to be positioned through the management of what counts as serious inquiry as something that serious people do not take seriously. The result, over time, is a self-reinforcing system in which the most important questions are the least likely to be investigated by the people with the most resources to investigate them. But the questions do not disappear. The pattern of reality does not alter itself to accommodate institutional preferences. And the human nervous system, even in the degraded conditions of contemporary technological civilization, retains the capacity that Hypatia's school was designed to develop. It cannot be engineered away. It cannot be educated out of existence. It surfaces persistently in individuals who have not been fully convinced that the contracted mode of operation available to them is all that they are. Individuals who feel, with a certainty that precedes and survives every attempt to rationalize it away, that the world as presented is not the world as it actually is, and that the gap between those two things is navigable by a human being who is willing to develop the faculties required for the navigation. These individuals are not rare in the way that the dominant culture would prefer to believe. The research on anomalous experiences, on spontaneous episodes of expanded awareness, of non-local perception, of the felt sense of direct connection to an intelligent field larger than the individual self, consistently finds that a substantial proportion of the general population reports experiences of this kind. Not marginal, not statistically negligible, substantial. And the consistent finding across studies conducted in different cultures, different time periods, different methodological frameworks, is that these experiences are profoundly meaningful to the people who have them, that they reorganize the person's understanding of reality, of mortality, of meaning, in ways that persist across decades and that are consistently associated with increased psychological well-being, increased compassion, decreased fear of death, and a deepened sense of connection to something that the experiencer struggles to name, but that they recognize, without ambiguity, as real. Hypatia would have recognized these individuals immediately. She would have recognized the particular configuration of sensitivity, of depth of processing, of the persistent, low-frequency knowing that something important is being missed by the frameworks on offer. Not as dysfunction, but as raw material, as the unrefined version of exactly what her training was designed to develop. She would have understood the exhaustion that comes from inhabiting a high-sensitivity nervous system in an environment that is not structured to support it, not as evidence of weakness, but as evidence of calibration. A finely tuned instrument in a noisy environment is not malfunctioning. It is simply in the wrong acoustic context. What would it mean to be in the right acoustic context? What would it mean to have access to the kind of training that Hypatia's school provided? Not as historical reconstruction, not as nostalgic fantasy about a lost golden age, but as a living, functional, contemporary practice that takes the ancient understanding seriously and translates it into forms appropriate to the situation of a human being navigating the specific conditions of the present moment. This is not a rhetorical question either. It has answers. They are not simple. They are not available in the format of a 10-minute video or a 30-day program or any of the other delivery mechanisms that the modern information economy has optimized for engagement rather than transformation. But they are available. The pattern has survived. The transmission is possible. And the fact that you are here, listening to this, with the quality of attention that this material requires and that you are bringing to it, is not nothing. It is, in fact, exactly what the next section of this audiobook is going to address. The specific, concrete, evidence-based understanding of what the development of field-coherent consciousness actually looks like. What practices have demonstrated measurable effects on the relevant neurological and physiological parameters, and what the convergence of ancient transmission and modern science suggests about the actual scope of what a human being, properly developed, is capable of perceiving, knowing, and participating in. Before we move into that territory, take a moment, not as instruction, as invitation. The number 888 appears in various systems of numerical symbolism as the marker of what comes after completion, the point beyond the cycle, the frequency of the next octave. If you feel that something in you has completed a cycle of understanding as you have listened to this section, that number may carry a quiet resonance for you, not as mysticism, as recognition. The specific practices that Hypatia's school employed were not arbitrary. They were not cultural decoration or religious ritual in the sense of prescribed behavior whose meaning had been forgotten and whose function had been reduced to symbolic performance. They were technologies, precisely that word in its original Greek sense of techne, which does not mean machinery, but means the disciplined application of knowledge to produce a specific, reliable, reproducible result. The result these technologies were designed to produce was a measurable, functional shift in the mode of operation of the human nervous system, from the contracted, locally bounded, threat-responsive mode that is the default of an uncultivated nervous system in a challenging environment, to the expanded, field-coherent, non-locally receptive mode that the ancient world recognized as the foundation of genuine knowledge and that modern neuroscience is beginning to measure with instruments sophisticated enough to detect what the ancients could only describe. The first and most fundamental of these technologies was sustained attention. Not attention in the diffuse, multitasking, perpetually interrupted sense that contemporary digital culture has normalized, and that cognitive neuroscience has demonstrated produces measurable degradation in the brain's capacity for deep processing. Sustained, single-pointed, voluntarily maintained attention directed at a specific object of contemplation, a geometric form, a mathematical relationship, a celestial pattern, the rhythm of one's own breath, for periods of time that the modern attention economy would consider extraordinary, but that every serious contemplative tradition across every culture considers the bare minimum for meaningful development. The research on the neurological effects of sustained attention practice is now extensive and consistent. Long-term practitioners of meditation, which is the contemporary Western term for the general category of practice that includes what Hypatia's school would have called contemplation, show measurable structural differences in brain regions associated with attentional control, emotional regulation, and the capacity for what neuroscientists call metacognition, the awareness of one's own cognitive processes as they occur. These are not subtle effects, detectable only by the most sensitive instruments. They are robust, replicable findings that have now been produced by research groups at Harvard, Stanford, Oxford, and numerous other institutions whose mainstream credibility makes the findings difficult to dismiss through the usual mechanisms of marginalization. But the practice of sustained attention was not, in Hypatia's school, an end in itself. It was preparation, the cultivation of the perceptual instrument before that instrument was directed toward the specific objects of investigation that the curriculum was actually about. Those objects were primarily mathematical and geometric forms, and the engagement with those forms was not calculation in the modern sense. It was contemplation, a specific mode of engagement in which the practitioner does not impose understanding on the object from outside, but allows the object's structure to be perceived from within by a faculty of knowing that the Neoplatonic tradition called nous, and that we might translate, with appropriate caution about the inadequacy of any single English word, as direct intellectual intuition. The knowing that arises not from inference, but from structural resonance between the knower and the known. This mode of knowing is not mystical in the sense of being beyond investigation. It is, increasingly, the subject of serious cognitive scientific inquiry under various labels: insight cognition, implicit learning, the aha phenomenon, Type 1 processing in dual process theories of cognition. The consistent finding across these research programs is that a significant portion of human knowing does not proceed through the serial, explicit, linguistically mediated reasoning process that conscious introspection naturally privileges. It proceeds through processes that operate below the threshold of conscious awareness, that integrate information across vast associative networks, simultaneously rather than sequentially, and that deliver their outputs to consciousness not as arguments, but as sudden, felt convictions of understanding, the unmistakable sense that something has clicked into place, that a pattern has been perceived that was not visible before, that the relationship between elements that previously appeared unconnected has suddenly become transparent. Scientists report this. Mathematicians report this. Artists report this. Contemplatives across every tradition report this as the characteristic signature of the mode of knowing that their practices are designed to develop and stabilize. It is not the exception to rational cognition. It is, the evidence increasingly suggests, the deepest and most powerful form of it. Hypatia's training was designed to make this mode of knowing reliable, voluntary, and applicable to questions of genuine significance. Questions about the structure of physical reality, about the nature of consciousness, about the relationship between the individual and the cosmos. The mathematical training provided the objects of contemplation and the vocabulary for communicating what was perceived. The astronomical training provided a direct sensory encounter with the scales and patterns of the cosmos that could anchor the practitioner's understanding of their place within a universe that was vast, ordered, and, in some sense, responsive to the quality of attention brought to it. And the philosophical training, the study of Plato, of Plotinus, of the Hermetic texts of the Pythagorean tradition in its full depth, provided a framework for integrating the perceptions that arose in contemplative practice into a coherent understanding of reality that could be communicated, examined, debated, and refined in dialogue with others engaged in the same inquiry. This integration between direct perceptual experience and rigorous intellectual framework is what distinguishes the tradition Hypatia represented from both the dry rationalism that has dominated Western academic philosophy since the 17th century and the ungrounded intuitionism that characterizes much of what passes for spirituality in the contemporary marketplace of ideas. The Neoplatonic school did not choose between reason and experience. It understood them as complementary modes of a single faculty of knowing. Experience without reason, producing uninterpretable noise. Reason without experience, producing elaborate structures disconnected from the reality they were supposed to describe. The integration of both, disciplined by sustained practice and refined in genuine intellectual community, produced what the tradition simply called philosophy in its original sense, the love and pursuit of wisdom, where wisdom means not information accumulated, but reality perceived directly and understood with clarity. Modern science, at its best, is attempting something structurally similar. The ideal of the scientific method, rigorous experimental design, careful measurement, honest reporting of results, subjection of conclusions to peer scrutiny, willingness to revise understanding in response to evidence, is an attempt to create a community of inquiry in which direct encounter with reality and rigorous intellectual framework check and refine each other. The problem is not the ideal. The problem is the gap between the ideal and the institutional reality of contemporary science. A gap that has been widening as the funding structures, publication incentives, and career dynamics of academic science have increasingly rewarded the production of publishable results over the pursuit of genuine understanding, and as the materialist framework that underlies most contemporary scientific practice has become less an empirically justified conclusion and more an unexamined assumption that shapes which questions get asked and which findings get taken seriously before the investigation even begins. The researchers who are now producing findings that converge on Hypatia's understanding are working at the edges of this system, often at personal and professional cost, always against the friction of a consensus that is not simply wrong, but is wrong in ways that are institutionally entrenched and that will not be revised without a reorganization of the incentive structures that maintain it. This is slow work. It is important work. And it is not the only work that matters, because institutional science, however valuable, is not the only mechanism by which genuine understanding of the kind we are discussing can be developed and transmitted. The direct path, the path of individual practice, of disciplined attention, of the cultivation of the perceptual faculty that Hypatia's school was designed to develop, remains available. It has always remained available because the capacity it develops is not stored in institutions or libraries or any external repository that can be burned or suppressed. It is stored in the architecture of the human nervous system itself, which retains, regardless of the cultural and institutional conditions in which it is embedded, the fundamental capacity for the kind of coherent, field-integrated, non-locally receptive operation that the ancient world called enlightenment, and that modern neuroscience is beginning to describe in the language of measurable neurological states. What the present moment offers that previous moments have not, or not to the same degree, is the convergence. The ancient understanding and the modern science are arriving at the same conclusions from different directions simultaneously. The fragments of the tradition that survived the centuries of suppression are being reconstructed with increasing accuracy and sophistication. by scholars who understand both the historical material and the contemporary science well enough to read the former in the light of the latter. And the technology of communication that makes it possible for this audiobook to reach you, wherever you are, whatever your background, whatever the specific form that your intuition that something important is being missed has taken in your particular life, is making the transmission possible at a scale and speed that has no historical precedent. This is not incidental. The pattern that has been suppressed across 15 centuries of deliberate institutional management is re-emerging precisely at the moment when the tools for its re-emergence are available, when the science is sophisticated enough to provide rigorous support for what previously could only be asserted through the authority of tradition, and when the accumulated dysfunction of the systems that were built on the suppression of this understanding is creating the conditions of urgency that make the alternative not merely interesting, but necessary. You are listening to this at this moment for reasons that exceed the purely mechanical explanation of search algorithms and recommendation systems. The field is not passive. The cosmos that Hypatia taught is responsive, not in the crude sense of granting wishes, but in the precise sense that a coherent system responds to coherent inquiry, that like attracts like at the level of informational structure, that the quality of attention you bring to these questions is itself a form of participation in the process by which the pattern re-emerges into human awareness. Some people who reach this point in the material find themselves wanting to mark the moment in some way, not dramatically but quietly. The number 333 in various traditions of numerical symbolism represents the point of synthesis, the moment when two streams of understanding converge into a third thing that is greater than either of them alone. The convergence of ancient transmission and modern science. The convergence of what you have known intuitively and what you are now encountering in explicit form. If that resonance is alive in you right now, the number will mean something. If not, simply carry forward what you have received and let it do what it does. We have arrived at the place where the history becomes personal. Not personal in the sense of anecdotal, not personal in the sense of therapeutic, but personal in the most rigorous and demanding sense of that word. The sense in which the understanding we have been developing across this entire audiobook stops being something you are learning about and becomes something you are learning to inhabit. This is the threshold that every serious student of this material eventually reaches. And it is the threshold at which most people stop. Not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack genuine interest, but because crossing it requires something that the information economy that delivered this content to you is structurally incapable of providing. A willingness to be changed by what you understand, rather than simply adding the understanding to the existing collection of things you know. Hypatia's students did not come to Alexandria to become more informed. They came to be transformed. The distinction is not semantic. Information is additive. It leaves the existing structure of the knower intact and simply increases the content available to that structure. Transformation is structural. It alters the architecture of the knower, the way the knower processes experience, the range of what the knower can perceive. The training Hypatia offered was explicitly designed to produce transformation in this precise sense. And she was clear with her students, according to the accounts that have survived, that the process was neither comfortable nor rapid. It required sustained engagement over years. It required the willingness to encounter, repeatedly, the edges of what one's current perceptual structure could accommodate, and to remain at those edges long enough for the structure itself to expand, rather than retreating to the familiar territory of what was already known. This description of the developmental process maps with striking precision onto what contemporary developmental psychology calls the movement through successive stages of meaning-making. The framework developed most comprehensively by researchers like Robert Kegan at Harvard, whose model of adult psychological development describes a sequence of increasingly complex and inclusive structures of consciousness, each of which can hold more of the complexity of reality without either simplifying it or being overwhelmed by it. Kegan's research, and the work of numerous colleagues and successors in the tradition of constructive developmental psychology, demonstrates that this development does not happen automatically with age or with the accumulation of information or experience. It happens through specific kinds of challenge, encounters with complexity that the current structure of consciousness cannot accommodate, combined with the support structures that allow the person to metabolize that challenge rather than simply defending against it. Hypatia's school was, among other things, a precisely engineered support structure for exactly this kind of development. The mathematical and philosophical curriculum provided the challenges, problems, and questions that could not be resolved by any currently available structure of understanding, that required the expansion of the perceptual and cognitive faculty itself to approach. The community of fellow students provided the relational context in which that expansion could be metabolized. The experience of being known and recognized by others engaged in the same process, which Kegan's research identifies as the single most important environmental factor in supporting genuine developmental movement. And Hypatia herself provided the function that every serious developmental tradition has called by various names: teacher, guide, initiator. The function of someone who has traversed more of the territory than the student, who can recognize where the student is in the process with an accuracy that the student cannot bring to their own situation, and who can provide the specific quality of attention and challenge appropriate to that precise location in the developmental landscape. The loss of this function, the loss of genuine teachers in this sense, as distinct from instructors who transmit information, or coaches who improve performance within an existing framework, is one of the most significant and least discussed consequences of the suppression of the tradition Hypatia represented. Information is now more available than at any point in human history. The capacity to transmit and access information has been expanded by digital technology to a degree that would have been literally incomprehensible to any previous generation. And yet, the development of genuine wisdom, of the structural transformation of consciousness that Hypatia's school was designed to produce, has not accelerated proportionally. If anything, the evidence suggests the opposite, that the same technological systems that have made information universally available have simultaneously made the conditions for genuine transformative development harder to sustain. By fragmenting attention, by eliminating the sustained periods of stillness and difficulty that structural development requires, and by replacing the living transmission that passes between a genuine teacher and a genuinely committed student, with the simulacrum of understanding that comes from consuming content, however sophisticated and accurate that content may be. This audiobook is content. It is honest about that. What it can do is point. What it can do is provide a map of sufficient accuracy that someone who is genuinely oriented toward the territory it describes can use it to navigate more effectively than they would without it. What it cannot do, what no content can do, is provide the territory itself. The territory is your own nervous system, your own perceptual development, your own sustained encounter with the edges of what your current structure of consciousness can accommodate. That encounter cannot be outsourced. It cannot be consumed. It can only be undergone. What does undergoing it actually look like in the specific conditions of contemporary life? This is where the convergence of ancient understanding and modern science becomes most practically significant. Because while the specific cultural forms in which Hypatia's training was embedded, the particular mathematical curriculum, the specific texts, the social structure of the ancient Alexandrian school, are not directly replicable in the present context, the underlying principles that those forms were designed to implement are entirely replicable. And the modern neuroscience of contemplative practice, of developmental psychology, and of consciousness research provides a framework for implementing them that is, in some respects, more precise and more accessible than what was available to Hypatia's students. The foundational practice is the same across every tradition that is genuinely engaged with the development of expanded consciousness. The deliberate, sustained, voluntary direction of attention maintained against the pull of distraction toward a specific object or quality of experience. The object matters less than the quality of the engagement. What matters is the deliberateness, the choice, repeated moment by moment, to remain with what is being attended to rather than following the endless associative drift that the untrained mind defaults to. This practice, sustained across months and years rather than days and weeks, produces the structural neurological changes that the research documents. Increased cortical thickness in regions associated with attentional control, increased functional connectivity between regions associated with self-regulation and those associated with present-moment awareness, decreased reactivity in the amygdala, the brain's primary threat detection system that underlies the shift from the chronic contraction of the default stress response to the baseline coherence from which expanded perception becomes accessible. This is not a minor adjustment in psychological functioning. It is a reorganization of the operating system. And it is a reorganization that, once initiated and sustained, tends to become self-reinforcing because the expanded perceptual capacity that begins to develop makes the practice intrinsically rewarding in ways that mere discipline cannot sustain indefinitely, and because the increased coherence of the nervous system makes the conditions of ordinary life less depleting and more navigable, freeing resources for the kind of sustained inward attention that the practice requires. The mathematical dimension of Hypatia's training, the use of geometric and numerical relationships as objects of contemplation, has a contemporary equivalent in what is sometimes called sacred geometry, though that phrase has been so thoroughly colonized by the shallow end of the alternative spirituality market that it requires careful rehabilitation before it can be used with precision. The underlying reality to which it points is genuine and is now supported by considerable scientific evidence. The mathematical ratios that appear consistently across scales of physical organization, the golden ratio, the Fibonacci sequence, the specific harmonic relationships that generate the overtone series in acoustics, are not decorative patterns that human beings have found aesthetically pleasing for arbitrary cultural reasons. They are the signatures of the organizational principles that govern how coherent systems of all kinds, from the molecular to the galactic, maintain their integrity and their capacity for information processing across time. Engaging with these ratios contemplatively, not calculating them, but perceiving them, allowing the visual or conceptual encounter with their structure to resonate within the perceptual system, is, the ancient tradition maintained and the modern evidence supports, a way of training the nervous system to recognize and operate in accordance with the organizational principles of coherence itself. This is why the training worked. Not because of cultural tradition, not because of authority, because of structural resonance, because the patterns being contemplated are the same patterns that the nervous system, at its most coherent, embodies. The contemplation of mathematical beauty is not a leisure activity for people who happen to enjoy abstraction. It is, when engaged with the depth and discipline that Hypatia's curriculum demanded, a technology for the progressive alignment of the human perceptual system with the organizational logic of the cosmos within which that system is embedded. Alignment, in this precise sense, is what the ancients meant by the word that translators have rendered as enlightenment, or illumination, or gnosis. Not a supernatural visitation, not a reward for virtue, a structural condition of the nervous system, measurable, developable, and carrying with it the perceptual capabilities that the tradition attributed to it and that the emerging science is beginning to document. The astronomical dimension of the training carries a similar logic. The direct, sustained, attentive observation of celestial patterns, of the specific, precise, mathematically governed movements of bodies across timescales vastly exceeding the human lifespan, accomplishes something in the practitioner that cannot be achieved by reading about those patterns or hearing them described. It accomplishes a direct, felt reorganization of the practitioner's relationship to time and scale. The ordinary human nervous system operates primarily in the timescale of the immediate, the next few hours, the next few days, occasionally the next few years. This temporal horizon is not a feature of consciousness in general. It is a feature of consciousness organized around survival, around the urgent, pressing, relentlessly immediate demands of biological and social existence in the conditions under which most contemporary human beings live. Expanding that temporal horizon, genuinely expanding it, not intellectually acknowledging that the universe is old, but viscerally, perceptually inhabiting a sense of time that encompasses geological and cosmological scales, reorganizes the significance of everything that ordinarily presents itself as urgent, as threatening, as the consuming preoccupation of a contracted self. What appeared catastrophic from within the narrow temporal horizon of survival consciousness appears, from the expanded temporal perspective that sustained astronomical contemplation can produce, as a brief, local fluctuation within a process of almost incomprehensible scope and beauty. This shift in perspective is not denial. It is not dissociation. It is a more accurate perception of reality, one that includes the immediate without being imprisoned by it. Now we arrive at the question that this entire audiobook has been building toward, though perhaps not in the form you anticipated. The question is not what Hypatia knew. We have addressed that in the detail that this format permits. The question is not what was destroyed when she was killed. We have addressed that too, with the historical and scientific evidence that makes the scope of that destruction legible. The question is what you do with this understanding, not in the abstract, not as a philosophical position, but as a living human being navigating a specific life in a specific historical moment that is, by any serious measure, one of the most consequential moments in the history of the species. The answer that the tradition Hypatia represented would give is both simpler and more demanding than anything the modern self-improvement industry is prepared to offer. It is this: begin. Not with a program, not with a purchase, not with the acquisition of any additional information beyond what is sufficient to orient you toward the practice. Begin with the most fundamental technology available to any human being, regardless of circumstance. The deliberate direction of attention, sustained against distraction, toward the most real thing you can find to attend to. For some people, that is the breath. For some, it is a mathematical relationship. For some, it is the night sky. For some, it is the quality of awareness itself, the luminous, self-evident fact of experiencing prior to any particular content of experience. The object is less important than the quality of the engagement. Begin. Sustain. Return when distracted, and you will be distracted endlessly because that is what an untrained nervous system does, without judgment, without drama, without the self-condemnation that is itself a form of distraction. Return. Again and again, across days that become weeks, that become months, that become years. This is the ascension code in its most practical and least glamorous form. Not a secret revealed in a single moment of dramatic illumination, a practice, a direction, a sustained, disciplined, patient movement toward the expansion of perceptual capacity that Hypatia spent her life transmitting, that the institution that murdered her spent centuries suppressing, and that the convergence of ancient wisdom and contemporary science is now making available with increasing clarity and precision to anyone willing to bring to it the quality of attention it deserves. Hypatia was 35 years into a life of that kind of attention when she was dragged into the street and killed. What she had developed in those years, the clarity, the precision, the capacity for non-local perception, the ability to transmit understanding that reorganized the students who received it, was not lost with her body. It was encoded in the students who carried it forward, in the fragments of text that survived, in the mathematical and philosophical tradition that preserved pieces of the pattern across the centuries of suppression that followed. And it is encoded now in the convergence of evidence that points, from every direction that serious inquiry has approached it, toward the same fundamental understanding of what the cosmos is, what consciousness is, and what a human being, properly developed, is capable of. You have been listening for a significant period of time. Something in you chose to do that. Something in you sustained the attention that this material requires when the easier options, the shorter, simpler, more immediately gratifying content that the same technology could have delivered, were always available. That choice, that sustained attention, is not nothing. It is, in fact, the beginning of the practice. It is the earliest, most tentative expression of the faculty that Hypatia spent her life developing in her students. Recognize it as such. Not with pride, not with self-congratulation, but with the quiet, clear-eyed acknowledgement that something real is happening, that the recognition you have been experiencing as you listened is not wishful thinking, but the perceptual faculty beginning to orient toward the signal it was always designed to receive. The woman who knew too much was not destroyed. The knowledge that killed her is alive in the structure of reality itself, in the mathematical architecture of the cosmos, in the quantum coherence of biological systems, in the non-local field of information within which every human nervous system is continuously embedded. It is alive in you, as potential as the raw capacity that the right kind of attention and the right kind of practice can develop into something that changes not just what you know, but what you are able to perceive, and therefore what you are able to become. That becoming is not guaranteed. Nothing about the human situation is guaranteed, but it is available. It has always been available, and the fact that you are here at the end of this transmission with the quality of presence that you have brought to it suggests that you already know, not as a thought, but as that deeper, more reliable form of knowing that this entire audiobook has been about, that the path is real, that the capacity is real, and that what Hypatia gave her life to transmit is worth, at minimum, the sustained and serious attention of a human being who has recognized, however partially and however recently, that the world as presented is not the world as it actually is. What comes next is yours to determine. The field is responsive. The pattern is available. The practice begins wherever you are. If something in this transmission has landed in you at a level deeper than ordinary information, if you recognize in what you have heard not just ideas, but something that feels like memory, like the return of something that was always known, some people find themselves moved to mark that recognition quietly, not as performance, not as participation in a trend, but as a private signal between themselves and whatever it is they have just encountered. The numbers 520 and 1111 carry, in various frameworks of resonance and pattern recognition, associations with awakening, with the moment a signal becomes clear enough to act on. If either of those numbers means something to you right now, you will know what to do. If not, carry what you have received and let it work in you at whatever depth it has reached. The transmission continues. But transmission, in the deepest sense of that word, is not a one-directional process. It is not a broadcast from a source to a passive receiver. It is a resonance, a mutual activation between two systems that share underlying structural properties, in which the signal from one calls forth the latent capacity of the other, and in which that calling forth itself transforms both the receiver and, in some sense that the ancient traditions took seriously and that modern field theories of consciousness are beginning to formalize, the field within which both are embedded. You are not simply receiving this information. You are participating in the reemergence of a pattern that has been suppressed for 15 centuries. That participation has weight. It has consequence. It matters in ways that extend beyond your individual life and your individual development into the larger process by which human civilization either finds its way back to a relationship with reality that is accurate enough to sustain it, or does not. This is not hyperbole. The crisis of the present historical moment is, at its deepest level, a crisis of consciousness. A crisis produced by the gap between the complexity of the challenges facing the species and the complexity of the consciousness available to address them. The environmental crisis, the political crisis, the crisis of meaning and mental health and social cohesion that is producing measurable increases in depression, anxiety, loneliness, and despair across the developed world. These are not separate problems requiring separate technical solutions. They are expressions of a single underlying condition, a civilization operating from a contracted, locally bounded, fear-responsive mode of consciousness that was adequate for managing the challenges of a simpler world, and that is catastrophically inadequate for managing the challenges of the world that civilization has now produced.
The expansion of consciousness that Hypatia School was designed to produce is not a luxury available to people who have resolved all their practical concerns and are looking for something more interesting to do with their remaining attention. It is a necessity, the most urgent and most neglected necessity of the present moment. A species navigating the complexity of the 21st century with the contracted consciousness of the survival response is a species that will continue producing, at increasing scale and speed, exactly the kinds of outcomes that contracted consciousness always produces: short-term optimization at the expense of long-term viability, in-group protection at the expense of out-group recognition, the ruthless exploitation of whatever can be exploited before the consequences of that exploitation become undeniable. The pattern is not mysterious. It is the predictable output of a particular mode of consciousness operating in conditions of complexity that exceed its processing capacity. What Hypatia understood, and what the convergence of ancient wisdom and contemporary science is now making available in forms that did not previously exist, is that the expansion of consciousness is not a project that must wait until the practical crises have been resolved. It is the prerequisite for resolving them. The quality of the solutions available to a civilization is a function of the quality of the consciousness that generates those solutions. Expand the consciousness, and the solution space expands with it. Problems that appear intractable from within one level of consciousness frequently reveal elegant and previously invisible solutions when approached from a more expanded level. This is not magical thinking. It is the consistent finding of developmental psychology, of organizational research, of the history of scientific discovery, that genuine breakthroughs do not come from more effortful application of the same cognitive tools that have already failed to produce the breakthrough, but from the expansion of the perceptual and cognitive apparatus itself to a level at which the solution is visible. Hypatia was not naive about the difficulty of this. She lived in a civilization that was, by the measures available to her, in serious decline, politically fragmented, culturally polarized, its greatest intellectual institutions deteriorating under the combined pressure of institutional neglect and ideological conflict.
She chose, in that context, not to retreat into private contemplative development, but to teach, publicly, visibly, at personal risk, because she understood that the expansion of consciousness is not only a personal project, it is a transmission. It is something that passes between people through the medium of genuine intellectual and relational encounter, and that generates in communities of people engaged in that transmission something that no individual practitioner can generate alone. A field of coherence, a shared elevation of the baseline from which individual development proceeds, a living demonstration that the expanded mode of consciousness is real, is stable, is communicable, and is worth the cost of its development. That cost is real. It would be dishonest to minimize it. The development of genuine perceptual expansion requires the willingness to encounter, repeatedly and without the protection of established frameworks, the raw complexity of reality as it actually is, rather than as the contracted self needs it to be. It requires the relinquishment of certainties that have provided orientation and comfort, not because certainty is inherently bad, but because the certainties available at any given stage of development are necessarily partial. They are the maps that the current perceptual structure can generate,
And they become obstacles to the next stage of development precisely because their familiarity makes the territory they fail to represent invisible. It requires the capacity to sustain not knowing, to remain in the discomfort of genuine uncertainty long enough for a more adequate understanding to emerge from within the encounter with complexity, rather than retreating to the premature closure of a simpler story that the nervous system can more easily metabolize. This capacity for sustained not knowing, for the productive inhabitation of uncertainty, is, the developmental research consistently finds, the single most reliable predictor of movement to more expanded stages of consciousness. It is also, not coincidentally, the capacity that the dominant culture most systematically discourages. The information environment rewards confident assertion over honest uncertainty. The social environment rewards the performance of having answers over the genuine practice of engaging with questions. The educational environment, almost universally, evaluates students on their ability to produce correct responses rather than their ability to sustain and deepen genuine inquiry. The result is a civilization populated largely by people who have been systematically trained across their entire developmental history in exactly the opposite of the capacity that their own further development requires. Recognizing this is not cause for despair. It is cause for a very specific kind of clarity, the kind that allows you to understand why the development you are capable of has not already happened spontaneously, without concluding that it is therefore impossible, or that you are somehow deficient for not having achieved it under conditions specifically structured to prevent it. The conditions were not designed to support your development. They were designed to produce a particular kind of functioning, economically productive, socially compliant, sufficiently engaged with the available forms of consumption and distraction to sustain the systems that produce and deliver them. That is not the same thing as your development, and is, in significant respects, in conflict with it. Understanding this distinction clearly and without self-pity is the beginning of the kind of agency that genuine development requires. Agency in this context
does not mean the dramatic rejection of existing systems or the performance of rebellion against the structures that have shaped you. It means the quiet, persistent, disciplined redirection of attention, the most fundamental resource available to any conscious being, toward what actually matters, in the face of the endless, sophisticated, algorithmically optimized pull of what merely demands attention. This is not easy. It is not supposed to be easy. The development of any significant capacity is not easy. But it is possible. The human nervous system retains, regardless of the conditions in which it has been embedded, the fundamental architecture that makes the expansion of consciousness available as a real developmental trajectory rather than a metaphysical fantasy. The evidence for this is not only the scientific research we have been discussing. It is the existence, across every culture and every historical period, including the most suppressive, of individuals who underwent genuine developmental transformation and who left behind, in various forms, the traces of that transformation and the transmissions that made it possible for others to follow. Hypatia was one of those individuals. She was not the first. She will not be the last. The lineage of which she was a part, the long, disrupted, partially suppressed but never fully eliminated lineage of human beings who have developed the capacity for genuine field-coherent consciousness and who have committed themselves to transmitting that development to others, is alive.
It is alive in the researchers whose work we have discussed. It is alive in the contemplative traditions that have preserved functional knowledge of the developmental process across centuries of institutional pressure. It is alive in the individuals, and there are more of them than the dominant culture's story about what is normal and what is possible would suggest, who have arrived through their own sustained practice and genuine encounter with the complexity of reality at levels of perceptual and cognitive development that the mainstream frameworks available to them have no adequate language for, but that are, in every measurable respect, real. And it is alive in potential in you. Not as flattery, not as the kind of empty affirmation that the self-help industry deploys to generate the feeling of significance without the substance of development. As a structural fact about what the human nervous system is capable of when it is given the conditions, the sustained practice, the genuine community, the honest encounter with complexity, the willingness to be changed by what is understood that the development requires. The woman who knew too much died in a street in Alexandria in 415 CE. What she knew did not die with her. It has been waiting, encoded in the structure of reality itself, for the conditions of its reemergence. Those conditions are present now, more fully than at any point in the 15 centuries since her death. The science is here. The fragments of the tradition are recoverable. The technology of transmission is available at a scale that makes the reach of her teaching in Alexandria look, by comparison, almost intimate. What is needed now is what was always needed: human beings willing to take the development seriously, willing to bring to the practice the quality of sustained, disciplined, honest attention that genuine perceptual expansion requires, willing to transmit what they develop in whatever forms their particular life and capacities make available to them, into the field of a civilization that needs, with an urgency that is difficult to overstate, Exactly what Hypatia spent her life offering. That is the invitation, not the conclusion. There is no conclusion to a transmission that is ongoing, and that you are now, by virtue of having listened to this with the quality of attention you have brought to it, a part of. The invitation. What you do with it is, as it has always been, entirely and completely yours to determine. If something in you has shifted as you have moved through this material, if the recognition that has been building across these hours of listening has arrived at a point of quiet clarity that feels less like a new belief and more like the return of something always known, some people find that this moment carries a particular quality of presence that they want to acknowledge. Not loudly, not performatively. The numbers 888 and 520 have been associated in frameworks of resonance that predate our current moment by centuries, with the frequency of completion and new beginning simultaneously. The point at which one cycle closes and the energy of what has been learned becomes available for what comes next. If those numbers carry meaning for you in this moment, the recognition is its own signal. If not, simply carry forward what has been received and trust the process that has already begun. This has been MindRise Audiobooks. The pattern is alive. The transmission continues.